Alright, so I'm aware this is a bit of a different video for the channel, and that the channel is called August Movie Reviewer, but I wanted to stray away from that and do something a bit different. So without further ado, this is a tier list of the 6 studio albums of my pretty much my favorite band, the Mars Volta. This is an El Paso group headed by Omar Rodriguez Lopez and Cedric Bixler Zvala, and I really, really dig their music. So I just kind of wanted to go through and do a ranking of their albums. We'll go in chronological order, and I'll put them on the tier list, and that'll be it. Starting off with their debut album, Deloused in the Comatorium. This album is absolutely the best way to get into the Mars Volta. It is so catchy and memorable, but that being said, it is by no means a pop album. This album's production is just incredibly chaotic and anxiety-inducing, and every song just has moments that are so catchy and iconic. They're impossible to forget. I mean, your first listen, you will just take away some of the more memorable and confusing vocal lines from Cedric. And as you listen to it more, you will realize just how fantastic of storytellers these two are. Deloused in the Comatorium's story is a hellish nightmare in every sense of the word, and it is an absolute essential progressive rock listen, and just all the playing, and a constant throughout all of their albums is the production is just insane. So yeah, this is just a fantastic album to get into the band, and it is one of the most iconic albums of the 2000s. I have to put this in S tier. But following that, they moved into their second studio album, also in the progressive rock genre, but blending in some ambient elements, Francis the Mute. Francis the Mute is, of all of the Mars Volta records, the hardest to listen. Its ambient passages can easily frustrate a ton of listeners, and you might just think it is the most boring thing ever. But I promise you, if you give it a chance and a couple listens, you will realize that this record is fantastic. One of the Mars Volta's best themes throughout their discography is the theme of religion and how it is interpreted from album to album, and I feel Francis has just the absolute best of that. There is nothing in their discography that tackles these themes as well as Francis does. This album is also, once you understand the story that is going on, one of the bleakest and most depressing listens imaginable, and it makes the use of the genre of ambient so much more purposeful. And the ambient passages are just as interesting as the vocal parts. You could remove these and make one progressive rock album that's just the vocals, and one ambient album that is just the ambient instrumentals, and both would be fantastic. And by God, do I even need to mention the song Cassandra Gemini, which is just the best possible closing track to any Mars Volta album, period. It is about half of the length of the record, and this record never feels its runtime of 77 minutes, the longest in their discography. I mean, gosh, what else can I say? It just improves upon Deloused in almost every way possible and every way you could want. Like, I'm putting this in the S tier, but we're gonna move Deloused right over to put Francis above it because this is my favorite album of theirs. Anyways, next, their third album, Amputecture. Now, Amputecture is way less conceptual than Francis and Deloused, but that's not to say that's a bad thing, because pretty much all of the songs on here are just really fun listens, and they have just fantastic guitar solos, like the building solo on the opening track, Vicarious Atonement, or the solo that leads into the intro of Viscera Eyes. Oh my god, both of those are just stick out in my mind as being incredible. And this album just has some of the band's best playing, period. Full stop. Like, this is just some of their best material, but the biggest downside is, following Francis the Mute, it tackles many of the same themes of religion as Francis does, but it does them in a way that is unfortunately way less interesting than Francis and the Mute. Francis the Mute. I think I've been saying and the Mute, but it's Francis the Mute. I'm unprofessional. I have it written in front of me. But yeah, this is a solid record, but in my opinion, just the fact that it isn't as conceptual and it doesn't really adventure as much as the first two, I'm gonna put it in the B tier. Next is their fourth album, The Bedlam in Goliath, and this is an album that I'm going to have to defend, because I know a lot of people do not like The Bedlam in Goliath. But here's what I will say. This is an incredibly experimental album, vocally and instrumentally, and it is definitely something where, if you're not big into Cedric's constant use of falsetto on this album, you might just think it's the most annoying thing you've ever heard. And I mean, Jesus, there's so much more to say about this album. I mean, I just love how they take these themes of religion that they've been hammering away at for their past two albums. But on this album, what they do is they reinterpret it in a unique way by making this album a progressive rock exorcism of the band. And it's the coolest concept ever. If you don't know what I'm talking about, seriously, look up the backstory to this album. It is the craziest friggin' thing. Yeah. And the thing is, that's not even the only way to appreciate it, because you can appreciate it from the perspective of it being a metaphor for Islamic society, which is why a lot of the vocals are incredibly androgynous. A great example that comes to mind is the song Goliath. Yeah, which has just these very androgynous vocals that, like, the hook to that song is something that just screams these kind of themes to me. But what keeps it back from being in the S tier, and why I'm feeling closer to the A tier, is that it does have a couple moments where, even though I love this album, I do find a bit of the constant use of, like, Cedric's upper register, it can get a bit annoying, but nonetheless, Jesus, this album is so underrated and I love it, and that's kind of my defense of it. And now, their fifth album, Octahedron. Earlier, I mentioned that their debut, Deloused, is by no means a pop record. But what I do think is their pop record is Octahedron. But that's by no means bad. Even the band admits it's their pop album. Like their junior effort, Amputecture, it does not have a particularly unifying it does not have a particular unifying story. And as a whole, it's probably their least memorable project. And there are some songs that are very straightforward on this thing that is not something you would expect from the Mars Volta, considering their highly conceptual and cryptic earlier records. And you can either look at this as being the biggest downside or the biggest upside to this album, because it really does change the format of their songwriting. That being said, it still has a ton of great songs, like with Twilight as my guide, Cotopaxi. I mean, some of what I think of when I think of this record is some of their best work as a whole, like single-wise, but probably some of their most kind of inconsistent work in terms of album-wise. So, I know I've said a couple negative things about it, but I really do like Octahedron, and I'm going to put it in the B tier, under Amputecture. And finally, their final album, Nocturna Kit. Now, Nocturna Kit is, in terms of just the number of tracks, their longest album. It has 13 songs, and at that, it feels just a bit bloated at points. But the thing is, I think if this record were cut down a tiny bit, it might be just the tiniest bit better, and it might even be a tier higher for me, which you'll know what that is once I say what the tier is. But anyways, I digress. This is returning to their concept albums, of course, and this album has a very fairy tale-esque feel to it, and where the Bedlam and Goliath had a very Islamic-centric view, Nocturna Kit has a very Hindu-centric view, I guess, as a way to phrase it. It's kind of tough to explain, but yeah, this album is about as anxious and catchy as the Mars Volta gets. Just look at the first two songs on this thing, which are just incredibly blood-pumping, anxiety-inducing singles. And I think, as I mentioned, this is a very fairy tale-esque album. And what contributes to that is the synths and psychedelic production on this album, and it really helps bring to life that quality of this album. But yeah, I think if this thing was cut down a bit, it might be in the A tier, but for now I'm going to stick it at the top of B tier, ahead of Amputecture and Octahedron. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say. So, of course, that's my tier list, and before the video ends, I wanted to give a shout out to my friend Jake Anderson for attempting to to guess the ranking of this list, which, for those who couldn't guess, it's from bottom to top: Octahedron, Amputecture, Nocturna Kit, the Bedlam and Goliath, Deloused the Comatorium, and Francis the Mute. I'd like to thank Jake for attempting to guess and getting none of the positions correct. But yeah, this is just a very experimental video. I might return to this this style again in the future. Who knows? But I had fun making this, so thank you for listening or watching, whichever you're doing. Goodbye.